Seems like something I shouldn't have to say, right? You always need your Bibles. But I'm not going to have any PowerPoints tonight, so I'm going to make you work a little harder tonight to go to these passages. But I hope that you will get your Bibles ready, and you can be turning to Exodus 22. That's where I'll begin in earnest here in just a moment. Good to see all of you tonight. Appreciate your interest, obviously. And I look forward to Sunday nights. It's a little different than Sunday morning in some ways. It just feels a little different to me. And so that's typically why I stand down here and get a little closer to you. I hope that's okay with you. Ladies, remember the study tonight at our house after services. If you can go, I know that that would be a benefit to you and you'd enjoy being together. So I hope that you'll do that. And remember also the upcoming studies tomorrow night at our house for anybody who can come. We'd love to have you at 7. And then Tuesday night at Allison's and Lee's house at 7 for the college class. So remember those opportunities as well as other things that are upcoming. Take advantage of those always as much as you can. Proverbs 6:32 says this: "The one who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He who would destroy himself does it." That's pretty strong language. Pretty strong language from a pretty smart man who spoke by inspiration about a subject that is always needed. I'm talking about, particularly about, in that passage, he obviously indicates it as being adultery, but we're talking about sexual sin. And while much about what I want to talk about tonight deals with adultery, I think the ideas that I'm going to present, hopefully, that you can see from the Word of God are things that all of us need to consider, whether married or not, because all of us can be affected by these things. So tonight I want to talk to you about really what the Proverbs say about sexual sin. That's kind of the direction we're going to go. And I would suggest to you as I begin this lesson that any discussion about sensuality generally or sexuality specifically requires some things from a teacher or preacher. It requires that he be biblical. I think it requires that he be clear. It requires that he be sensitive. Requires that he be selective, requires that he be judicious, requires that he be mature, and it requires that he be objective, among a few things that it requires. And what's interesting about that list is that's what's required of you as well. All those things that I just mentioned about me are going to be required about you. Anytime you talk about this subject, you run some risk. Practically, you run some risk by talking about this subject in an audience that is so wide in terms of age. But I want to share something with you that I have found out through my years of preaching. Sometimes I think that because we tend to try to shy away from things that need to be said, and as a result, we aren't as clear as we ought to be. We don't state the facts as we need to state them. We don't challenge the hearer and ourselves as clearly as we need to, because maybe we are so sensitive about that. And again, I'm not suggesting in any kind of way that we shouldn't be, but I would suggest that when you talk about things that relate to the matters that we're going to talk about tonight, you always have to be clear about that. And so in my preaching about these kinds of things, I try to be, and I try to be very selective as to what I say. And as I said, a lesson like this is always needed. Now, I'm not going to deal with some things that you may be thinking I might deal with. That would come in other lessons about maybe some things that specifically relate to temptation and things like that. And we'll allude to some of that, but that's not specifically what this lesson is about tonight. So I'll just pretty much get into the lesson, and you, at the end of it, you'll know what it's about. So I don't need to say much more about that. But before I look at some of these matters specifically and address some things specifically, I want to look at maybe a little historical context. Because I think it's important for us to understand not only what the law of Moses said in reference to some of these things to Israel, but why that was important. So I want to deal with the historical context, really, of the law of Moses as it summarized some of the sexual mores that were affected by that Israelite society. And so when I think about what the Old Testament said, I think the idea is there that sexuality was predicated on two primary foundational principles. And let me share those with you first. First of all, and I think this is kind of, you probably you know this, but sexual relations were restricted to marriage. That was even true of the Old Testament. And what that meant, if you think about that, if you draw the necessary conclusion, what that meant is that virginity was expected in marriage. And I want you to think about how strong that particular maxim was. Look in Exodus 22, the passage I mentioned to you, and let's notice particularly verse 16 and 17. If a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. And if her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. The bride price was the price to be paid literally for the taking of a woman's virginity. And it was a strong price. And it was so strong that it would hinder any man from considering that and from being tempted like he might be. Go to Deuteronomy 22 as well. Again, these are passages and I'm going to ask you to turn to those passages, but we're going to look at several things in the Old Testament tonight as we begin this. Deuteronomy 22. And I want you to look at verse 28 and 29. If a man finds a young woman who is a virgin, who is not betrothed, and he seizes her and lies with her, and they are found out, then the man who lay with her shall give to the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has humbled her, and he shall not be permitted to divorce her all his days. And really what both of those verses are saying, and that is, if you engage in the premarital sex, what that meant was there was an expectation of marriage. And that expectation of marriage was there regardless of whether or not the woman became pregnant. If the act itself occurred, you were expected then to be married. And let me further say this, an Israelite man had a right to expect his wife to be a virgin. Those four passages state that. But I want you to turn again to this passage in Deuteronomy 22, and we're going to look a little earlier. Go back to verse 13. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front that what we're about to read is fairly graphic. But I want to make a point before I read these verses. I want us to see. I want us to see the value that the Lord puts on virginity. Because we live in a world that doesn't put emphasis on it. And I think because the world doesn't put emphasis on it, maybe we don't talk about it like we ought to talk about it. That's just a subjective comment. That's kind of what I think about that. But I want you to read, follow along as I read, beginning in verse 13 of Deuteronomy 22. If any man takes a wife and goes into her and detests her, or hate her, and charges her with shameful conduct and brings a bad name on her and says, I took this woman and when I came to her, I found she was not a virgin. Then the father and mother of the young woman shall take and bring out the evidence of the young woman's virginity to the elders of the city of the gate. And the young woman's father shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man as wife, and he detests her. And now he has charged her with shameful conduct, saying, I found your daughter was not a virgin. And yet these are the evidences of my daughter's virginity, and they shall spread the cloth before the elders of the city. Then the elders of that city shall take that man and punish him. And they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the father of the young woman, because he has brought a bad name on a virgin of Israel, and she shall be his wife. He cannot divorce her all his days. But if the thing is true, and evidences of virginity are not found for the young woman, then they shall bring out the young woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death with stones, because she has done a disgraceful thing in Israel, to play the harlot in her father's house. So you shall put away the evil from among you. And if a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, then both of them shall die, the man that lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall put away the evil from Israel. And it goes on and talks about some of the things that will be required in that situation. But what it shows you is the extent to which a man could go to have the virginity of this woman that he is maybe wanting to marry, to have it proven that maybe she was or wasn't a virgin. It's pretty graphic language. And in verse 21, notice what she's called. She says she has played the harlot. And since most unmarried women were not virgins, they were prostitutes. So a maiden who lost her virginity then would be considered basically a harlot. Now again, that's pretty graphic language, but I want us to see that. Because again, I think it shows the magnitude of what God put on this idea of virginity. And the second principle was this, that it was repugnant for a woman to have multiple sex partners. Interestingly, polygamy early, and I don't know all of the reasons for this, but polygamy was, at least, as we read some things in the Old Testament, at least it was I don't think it was, anyway was it preferred. It's not what God wanted, but there was a sense in which it was conceivable. I mean, too many things in the Old Testament would make us think that. It's not what God wanted, I don't think, ever. But polyandry, which was the woman having many husbands, was unheard of. It was unthinkable. And part of why it was unthinkable is because if a woman birthed a child with multiple partners, it would be hard for them, her, and anyone else to determine whose the child was. There were no DNA tests. It was just really her word against somebody else's word. And that was part of the emphasis there for her not to have multiple partners. That's not talking about the moral aspect of it. But all of that, I think, to show the importance of the moral fidelity in Israel. These are not passages that we usually go back and interject in lessons because first of all, because of the topic and because of what's stated. But they are important, I think, to help us see that this marital fidelity was emphasized. And when it came to things that were really not exclusively the backbone of the Mosaic Law, but were substantive. You think about this. You think about the firstborn, and think about the eldest having the rights, and think about the paternity of a child, and who the father was, and those inherited rights that would come. Really, paternity and inheritance rights laid squarely on the sexuality, and more important and more specifically, the fidelity of the woman. That was kind of the backbone in Israel. And it was a backbone of a part of that Mosaic Law. And I know that that's important because in Leviticus 20 and verse 10, the passage tells us, among other places, that a woman who committed adultery was to be executed. Now, we hear that and we're going, wow. Executed? Yeah. Executed. And a husband who was even suspicious that his wife was being unfaithful could bring her before the priest, and she would undergo this public ritual of having to drink what was called bitter water. And it was made up of substances that were close by that would be put in water, and she was made to drink. She had to swear to the priest that she had not been unfaithful. And of course, again, there was no scientific proof, but this was the strongest way for her to prove that yes, she was not unfaithful to her husband, or to show that yes, she was, because when she drank, the idea of drinking the bitter water was that water to go into her system, and if she was being unfaithful and not admitting to that, then God would in essence sterilize her organs so that she could not have children. It's pretty substantial reading. And I don't mean just reading to say that it's just interesting reading. It's not interesting in just the sense that it's interesting, but it's interesting in the sense of it shows the magnitude of the woman being faithful to her husband. But a man who committed adultery with another man's wife was condemned to execution as well. And both the man and the woman, it wasn't just that they're executed by stoning. They're put to death by stoning. Now, again, I think it shows the magnitude. That's what you did to homosexuality, to homosexuals. That's what you did to men and women who were involved in bestiality. You killed them, you stoned them. And so a man or woman involved in adultery was to be put to death by stoning. So think about these severe penalties. Yet adultery, as you think about all that, adultery must have been such a problem. Now, if I said to you now, the laws of the United States, and in some ways these were civil laws. There were moral consequences, but these are the civil laws that governed Israel, okay? Think about if we put these kind of laws in effect for this country. What do you think? I think that's going to go over. Well, you say, well, that's not going to happen. And that's not going to happen now. But just think about what that would do. And you may ask, well, wouldn't that be a deterrent? Was it a deterrent in Israel? Well, the temptation's still not there. And is there not a whole lot said in the Old Testament about this idea of adultery and this idea of being unfaithful? So yes, it was a problem. It was such a problem that if you go to, again, let's go back to the book of Proverbs. And so turn there. We'll spend a lot of the rest of our time in the book of Proverbs. The first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs, as most of you in this audience know, is basically it's the idea of a father talking to a son. And a lot of it has to do with this adulterous mentality, this idea of engaging in this sexual conduct with a woman who is adulterous. She is one who is looking for and pursuing younger men. And so these first 9 chapters of Proverbs are in essence a father talking to a son who is moving into adulthood. And in chapter 2 specifically in verse 17, notice what is said. Who forsakes the companion of her youth, this is talking about the woman, and forgets the covenant of her God, for her house leads down to death and her paths to the dead. Now, if you didn't know all those things that we just talked about, and you heard language like this, the path leads to the dead or the path leads to death, you might think, well, what that's really saying is that the path leads to a place that's not very good. No, what that's saying is the path leads to death. What that's saying is we're talking about dead, physical death. Now, that may not be all the wisdom writer has in mind, but when you think about the law of Moses, that is what that meant. So I want you to go to the 5th chapter now and begin in verse 8 and notice some other things about this. This is what can happen, or this is what could happen to a young man. And think about this. This is a father saying this to a young man. And again, if we don't read some of this specifically, what we may just think is, listen, it's just not a good thing. If you're going to do that, that's just not really a good thing. No, the language is much harder than that. It's much harsher than that. It's more direct than that, as is the case in Proverbs 5, beginning in verse 8. We're going to verse 7. Therefore, hear me now, my children, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Remove your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others, and your years to the cruel one. Lest aliens be filled with your wealth. He's not talking about space aliens. He's talking about others who aren't a part of this relationship. And your labors go to the house of a foreigner, and you mourn at last when your flesh and your body are consumed, and say, how I have hated instruction, and my heart despised correction. I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to those who instructed me. I was on the verge of total ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. So what he's saying is that the ramifications of this could be so bad that you'd lose everything. Now he's talking about materially. You'd lose everything materially. He's not just talking about the emotional consequence. He's saying, you go the way of this woman who is this adulteress, this seductress, if you will, and you could lose everything. So he's helping her see, or he's helping his son see the problems, the problematic way that this can be. Again, go to Proverbs 6. This is verse 27. Can a man take fire to his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one walk on hot coals and his feet not be seared? So is he who goes in to his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her shall not be innocent. People do not despise a thief if he steals to satisfy himself when he is starving. Yet when he is found, he must restore sevenfold. He may have to give up all the substance of his house. Whoever commits adultery with a woman lacks understanding. He who does so destroys his own soul. In other words, you may think it can be hidden, but it can't be hidden. Things will come out. Things will even happen to you practically. That's going to be bad. The ramifications of that are going to be extreme. And verse 32 says, if you commit adultery with a woman, you lack understanding, and he who does so destroys his own soul. That's the passage we read when we began tonight. That's the fundamental principle. If you're going to engage in that kind of activity, you're going to destroy yourself. So let's talk for a minute then about the solution. Much of our discussion tonight has been about adultery. We've not gotten into it much. I just wanted to share some things with you about the history and why that was so important in Israel. But even not just the adultery, and I think sometimes because we make a distinction between adultery and fornication, and I think there is a technical sense in which, yes, that those are two different things. Fornication can be both. Adultery is typically that which we talk about that has to do with those who are married engaging in fornication. But fornication is sinful. Whether you're married or not, fornication is sinful, and fornication carries those kinds of consequences. Now again, we're not talking about necessarily how to avoid fornication if you're unmarried. That's not this lesson. But again, the point of the lesson for me to share with you is I want you to see how God views this. So let's talk about avoiding any sexual sin, whether it be someone who's married or whether it be someone who is not married. I want you to turn over to Proverbs 8. This is wisdom personified. If I ask you in this audience, where is the chapter in Proverbs that talks about wisdom personified? Most of you probably would say verse or chapter 1, and that would be true. That's what I would say if somebody asked me the question. But Proverbs 8 says a lot of the same things and even extends it to some degree. So I want you to notice that with me if you would. This is Well, look at chapter 7 specifically. Let's look at chapter 7. Let me just say this to you about chapter 8 it covers it entirely. Everything about chapter 8 speaks to that. But I want you to look at chapter 7 specifically and verses 1 through 5. Notice what he says. He says, "My son, keep my words and treasure my commands within you. Keep my commands and live, and my law as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers, write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister. And call understanding your nearest kin, that they may keep you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words." Now, I know that he's talking about you, referring to his son, you, his son, and this adulterous woman. But just think about what he's saying is, the way that you avoid those kind of things is, you think about what wisdom says to you. That's apparent not only in chapter 7, but it becomes very apparent in chapter 8. So he's saying, make wisdom your sister. And make understanding your nearest kin. In other words, you know how close you are to your sister, and you know how close you are to your nearest kin. What he's saying is, you make wisdom the thing that's closest to you. And if you'll do that, then when these opportunities present themselves, you'll be in a position to say, no, I know that I shouldn't engage in that because I know what that's going to do. And I think that's the principle. We could talk about specifically, how do you avoid this situation? Or if you're in this situation, how do you avoid not progressing to this situation? But all of that can be met with, you listen to wisdom. And I think you could even say, literally you can listen to what your father says. I don't know any father who's going to encourage his son or his daughter to engage in that kind of activity. If they're reasonable and if they're moral, if they're thinking even practically about what's the best thing for their son or daughter. Nobody's going to do that. But wisdom personified surely going to say, don't involve yourself in that kind of activity. And then look at chapter 5, Proverbs chapter 5, beginning in verse 15. This is a passage, these verses that I'm about to read are verses that we typically would read about when we're talking about a married couple involving themselves in this kind of activity. And this is what should satisfy both. Drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets? Now, if you just let your mind think about this language, it's pretty specific and pretty direct. Let them be only your own and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. And as a loving deer and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times and always be enraptured with her love. For why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of a seductress? And then he goes on to say, for the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. His own iniquities entrap the wicked man. For he is caught in the cords of his sin, he shall die for lack of instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. But I think those last 3 verses are saying, but if you listen to wisdom, that's not going to happen to you. And so, let me just kind of go back to where we started. And let me be very blunt. What God expects in terms of the sexual union of individuals is He expects, and I think it's not too much to say He demands, or He requires, that a man and woman not engage in that kind of activity until they are married. Now, I know how the world would view what I just said. They would view that as extreme, and they would view that as nonsense. But you can't read the Old Testament, and you can't read the New Testament, passage like Hebrews that talk about marriage is honorable and the bed is undefiled. You can't read passages like that and reach any other conclusion other than what God expects is that people of God, people that have any moral compunction at all, say, I'm not going to engage in that kind of activity. And may I say this to everybody in this assembly tonight in 2018, when sexual activity among most people who are of age and who have the ability to function in that capacity is rampant. We all know that. We're not naive. We understand what goes on in our world. But I would say this to all of us, that just because it's 2018 and because the world does what it does not mean that we can neglect what God said. And I want us to be impressed tonight with what God says about virginity. And I want those of you who are yet to be married, who are still virgins, both men and women, I want you to understand that that's something you can be proud of, and that's something you need to maintain until you do marry. And let me say this, that if that particular thing has bypassed you, or we're too late to be talking about that with you, then you need to make sure that your behavior from this point on is godly, that it is sound, and that it is solid, and that it is as close to what God could expect of you as it can be. I don't know of much other way to say that other than just be specific about that. But when I see the value that God places on marriage and about sexual activity in marriage and about what He's pleased with and about what He's unpleased with, and the degree to which He has gone in the past to say this is not going to be tolerated, and if it happens, this is what will happen. When I see all of that and when I put all that together, what that ought to tell every single one of us is He's very serious about that. My concern is, how do I view it? How do I view it as a married man? How does my wife view it as my wife? And how do I view it as her husband? And I think that the Bible is clear about that. I hope that, if nothing else, it just, if I may say it this way, I hope it causes you to go, wow. That He's pretty serious about that. If you leave tonight and go, well, the Lord's pretty serious about that, then I think we will have made some progress, because He's very serious about it. And I hope that you will take it seriously, and I hope that you won't let what happens in our world generally affect what you do personally. Because if that's the case, then there's all sorts of things that we'll need to be talking about. But hopefully we're strong enough people of God to say individually, I know what God wants, and I know that's what I'm going to do. I hope that will be something that you'll think about. I would also add this, just pray to God to help you, whether married or unmarried. If you're married, that you'll be faithful. If you're unmarried, that you will wait until you are married to fulfill that very thing which God has given. That is a good thing, but that God has given for those who are willing to wait and wanting to wait. May God help us in all that. If you have a spiritual need tonight that we can help you with, we're going to sing an invitation song, and if you'd like to make that known to us, come to the front as we stand and as we sing.